Hello and welcome back to AJS101. This is Lesson 9, Part 2. And we're talking about sentencing in this lesson. So let's talk about the sentencing environment. Now, many factors that should and should not affect sentencing sometimes do. So let's talk about improper factors, factors that should never be used as part of a decision on the type of sentence and the severity of the sentence. So, obviously, the big no-no would be race. You would hate to have racial prejudice taking an effect on sentencing. That is a very bad one, very corrosive to society and race relations. Another improper factor might be the personal opinion of court personnel. If the defendant is a really annoying person, you would hate to have them, jack up the sentence a little bit because they didn't like the behavior or what the person said or did. Public opinion. Public opinion can run strong and passionate in some controversial cases. Maybe it's a controversial figure or a popular victim, but that public opinion should not really be a factor. It should really be the defendant, what the defendant did, and the defendant's prior history and things, legitimate things like that. Age. Age should probably not be a factor. You'd hate to have people, maybe sentencing individuals that were younger more seriously, except perhaps as part of an incapacitation program based upon data involving more than just their age. Demanding a trial. This shouldn't be a factor, but unfortunately it is. The plea bargaining system works in that if you take a plea to guilty, you'll get a lesser charge or a lesser sentence or both. The longer you delay, the less great the deal. And if you demand a trial and you're found guilty, you wind up with the most serious of the potential penalty ranges. And that, of course, is kind of bad, but it's done because that's how the system functions. Being represented by legal aid. If you're a rich, wealthy person, you might be able to get a really sharp attorney. If you're indigent, you might get an overworked novice legal aid lawyer, and that might affect your sentence, and that's not a good thing. So those would be kind of improper factors that sometimes do slip in, but hopefully not that much. Let's talk about the proper factors. What are the legitimate things to take into account in determining the seriousness and the type of a sentence? Well, obviously, probably number one would be the crime committed. What is the person being sentenced for? I mean, we want proportionality. But we also want to take into account the prior criminal history. Somebody who's a repeat offender should be punished more seriously than a first-time offender. The circumstances. There can be mitigating circumstances or aggravating circumstances. Somebody who steals to get drug money, that would not be a very mitigating. That would be a kind of an aggravating factor. Stealing to get milk money for your starving child would be a mitigating factor. So those things should be involved. And being on parole or probation at the time of the offense is another proper factor. If you've been released for a prior charge and trusted to be in society, and you break that trust by committing another crime, then you should have a certain enhancement to the penalty, even above the fact that you have a prior conviction, which was why you were on probation or parole. All right, let's talk about the pre-sentence report, because this helps guide judges within their limited discretion, because, again, we have a lot of structured sentencing today. So the pre-sentence report is a document which contains positive and negative information about the defendant and the crime so that the judge can make an appropriate sentencing decision. Again, we want to know the background of the person. Is the person addicted to drugs? And this also helps in terms of or maybe a non-incapacitation sentence. So maybe if it's probation, the individual would have drug treatment as a condition, and you'd have to know that in the pre-sentence report. The PSI, as it's called, is usually prepared by a probation officer, and it may be as short as a page, or it could be over a dozen pages. Information in the PSI comes from official records, mostly court and arrest records, but also comes from interviews with people who know the defendant. So it's a source of information that helps the judge exercise what discretion the judge has. Let's talk about the victim in the overall sentencing environment. Contemporary sentencing often takes into account the opinions and the needs of the victim, or his or her survivors if the victim was murdered. In addition, victims assistance agencies and victims compensation agencies help get compensation and aid from the state and other agencies. And victims are also encouraged to sue the perpetrator of the crime against them. Now, some criminal courts also order defendants to make restitution to victims as part of the sentence. So restitution is a monetary payment by the perpetrator to the victim, and it compensates them for the harm done, usually lost wages, medical expenses, damaged property, things like that. Some jurisdictions also allow victims to submit victims' impact statements detailing the effects of the crime on the victim or the survivors, so the judge can use them as a factor in sentencing. Because again, harm done is a factor in sentencing. Now, some states allow victims to take an active part in sentencing and parole hearings. Arizona does because we have that in our Constitution. But unfortunately, few victims choose to take part in the sentencing process, and research has also shown that when they do, they have only minor impact on the sentence. Now, what are the traditional sentencing options? Well, the 4 traditional sentencing sanctions that dominate sentencing are incarceration, probation, fines, and death, although sometimes 2 or more options can be combined. Now, convicted felons who are convicted in state courts are sentenced as follows. 45% go to prison, 26% go to jail, and 29% get probation. So again, for most convicted felons, right, most go to prison, but followed by jail and probation. Now, let's talk about fines. Fines involve the defendant paying a monetary amount to the state. Remember, restitution is paid to the victim. Fines are paid to the court, to the state. And fines are popular because they generate revenue. They also save the state the expense of incarceration, if there is no incarceration involved. They make the defendant work. If you have to pay a fine, you have to be employed to get the money. And they also deprive the defendant of the profits from the crime. And finally, they can be tailored to meet the severity of the offense and the ability of the defendant to pay. Fines are unpopular because they place defendants back into the community without supervision, assuming there's no probation with it. They are a mild form of punishment, especially for the rich. You know, a $500 fine for a millionaire is nothing. Therefore, they do discriminate against the poor. And finally, they're hard to collect if the person just doesn't pay or absconds. An interesting type of fine in some jurisdictions, not all, is the day fine. And the day fine is a fine where the amount is based upon the daily wage of the defendant. The more serious the crime and the more serious the defendant's prior record, the more days are used to calculate the fine. So the day fine takes away the inequity of paying fines between rich and poor defendants. So if your daily wage were $80 and the crime dictated a 10-day fine unit factor, then it would be 80 times 10 or $800. If, on the other hand, your daily wage were $2,000, then your 10 days would give you a $20,000 fine. So it factors in the salary of the people. All right, let's get finally down to the death penalty. Now, capital punishment is a punishment of death, and it is generally only given to certain types of murders. Historically, many crimes entailed a sentence of death, and many techniques have been used to kill the convicted. You watch the old movies, you see these. Hanging, having the guillotine, having your head beheaded. Being boiled in oil might be another one. Poisoning, stoning. In fact, stoning actually may still be done. I know it was at least done about 20 years ago One of my college professors was in Saudi Arabia, and they had a person who was being stoned to death for adultery. Now, the way that worked was that's a traditional punishment, Islamic punishment, and it's only given to somebody who says, I will accept that punishment. They have the option of getting a regular punishment, but I guess this guy was very religious, and so therefore he was stoned. He was in the middle of this circular area, and people threw stones until he died, which is pretty gruesome. So also burning at the stake, drawing and quartering. By the way, there's a lot of misinformation about drawing and quartering. People think that they get 4 horses with ropes attached and they tie a rope. A rope goes to each arm and each leg, 4 separate ropes, and then the horses go giddy up and they all take off and your arms and legs get pulled off. That's not drawing and quartering traditionally. And these are, by the way, these are like ancient punishments. Drawing and quartering, the drawing is in the early morning, the person is taken out of his jail cell and is tied by a rope behind a horse, and the horse is led, so the person is drawn out of the village. And once out of the village, the body is hacked into 4 separate pieces. That's the quartering. And the pieces are buried in separate locations, because the mythology of the time was that if your body is not buried whole, you will be condemned to wander the earth for all eternity. So that is the drawing and quartering. Another would be being thrown to the lions, very popular ancient Roman penalty. Crucifixion, they crucified Christ. Hanging, and the firing squad. Okay, and the firing squad was actually used, I think, in a Midwestern state maybe 15, 20 years ago, because it was still on the books. They had never taken it off. So I guess the person condemned to death figured he'd have one last jab at the state and make them shoot him with the firing squad. Okay, let's see. Today, only a limited number of crimes can result in the death penalty, and most executions today actually involve lethal injection. This handout also had electrocution or poisonous gas, but I think almost everybody does electrocution now. Crimes that involve death as a penalty include the murder of a police officer, serial killing, and murder for hire, being a hitman. The federal government in 31 states currently use capital punishment, although many have not executed anybody for many years because of delays and court challenges. And over 1,400 executions have occurred in the U.S. since 1975, when the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty as constitutional. 23 prisoners were executed in 2017, all by lethal injection. What are the arguments against capital punishment? Well, the convict may be innocent. You can't undo something if you killed them. Evidence also shows that it is not a deterrent, at least not a general deterrent. Hearing that people get executed doesn't really deter murder. A lot of murders are done when people are upset or angry or on the spur of the moment without real planning. It's imposed in an arbitrary manner. Rich people who can afford a good defense are less likely to get the death penalty, and discriminatory. Interestingly, it's blacks who kill whites that are more likely to be executed, not blacks in general, just blacks who kill whites, which I guess is even more, racially discriminatory. Another argument for the death penalty, rather against the death penalty, is that it's too expensive. The expenses mostly come from the very lengthy trial. The defendant, if he's innocent, has to be given all sorts of resources for private investigators and lab tests. And there are many, many appeals that drag on for years. Although, generally, I haven't heard too many people complain about the expense. I think most people don't really consider that or care. But that's an argument against it. And some people believe it's immoral. And again, that's an issue of morality. There are religious people who believe it's immoral. There are religious people who believe that it's not immoral. So that's an argument that, again, is based on faith and belief. So it's not really something that you can, look at evidence and say, yes or no, it's immoral. It's a value judgment. All right, what are the arguments for the death penalty? Well, obviously, retribution, or shall we say revenge, and also closure for survivors. They certainly get revenge. and it ends it. They don't have to worry about seeing the person later in life or the person getting out and enjoying themselves. It's also just desserts. Again, it's given for people who kill, and it's very proportional, very just dessertish. And finally, protection. While the death penalty may not be a general deterrent in that people hear about it and they don't do murders, it sure is an effective specific deterrent, because nobody who has ever been executed has killed again. So that's undisputable. Okay, so that concludes Lesson 9. So you can now study your notes and take the Lesson 9 and listen to the lectures and take the Lesson 9 test.